A frozen foot breaks through the ice on Mount Everest's north face. The boot is ancient, cracked by decades of wind and cold. Inside, faded red letters spell out a name that vanished a century ago: A.C. Irvine. For nearly 100 years, the mountain kept this secret buried beneath tons of snow and glacier ice. Now, as climate change melts Everest's ancient frozen layers, the mountain is finally speaking. And with it comes the possibility of answering mountaineering's most haunting question. Did two men reach the summit in 1924, 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay claimed the prize? The discovery was made in September 2024 by a National Geographic documentary team. They weren't searching for Irvine that day. They were filming glacier patterns when cinematographer Jimmy Chin spotted something unusual protruding from the ice. As they got closer, they realized what they had found. The sock inside the boot bore Irvine's name, stitched in thread that had somehow survived a century of Everest's brutal conditions. The team stood in silence, some fighting back tears, knowing they were the first people to find any trace of Andrew Common Irvine since he disappeared into the clouds on June 8, 1924. George Mallory was already a legend when he set his eyes on Everest for the third time. Born in 1886 in Cheshire, England, he grew up climbing the rocks and crags of Wales and Scotland. By his 20s, Mallory had established himself as one of Britain's finest alpinists. He was graceful on rock, almost dancer-like in his movements, and possessed an intensity that bordered on obsession when it came to mountains. His father was a church rector, and Mallory grew up in a world of discipline and expectation. He attended Winchester College and later Magdalen College, Cambridge, where he studied history, but spent most of his time climbing. At Cambridge, George Mallory met some of the most influential figures in British mountaineering. He joined the Climbers Club and began tackling increasingly difficult routes in the Alps. His climbing style was described as elegant and bold, taking risks that more conservative climbers avoided. He also met his future wife, Ruth Turner, at a country house party in 1914. They married that same year, just as World War I broke out. Mallory served as an artillery officer in France, surviving the trenches while many of his friends did not. The war changed him, made him more aware of mortality and the fragility of life. When asked why he wanted to climb Everest, George Mallory's response became immortal: "Because it's there." But those three simple words masked years of failure, frostbite, and broken dreams that would ultimately consume him. Mallory had already attempted Everest twice before 1924. In 1921, he was part of the first British reconnaissance expedition that mapped routes up the mountain. The team surveyed the northern approaches from Tibet, identifying possible routes through the treacherous ice falls and rock bands. Mallory was the first person to extensively explore the North Col route, which would become the standard approach for decades. In 1922, George Mallory returned to Everest and pushed higher than anyone had ever climbed, reaching over 27,000 feet before being turned back by weather and exhaustion. On that expedition, they used bottled oxygen for the first time in mountaineering history, though the equipment was primitive and unreliable. Mallory initially despised the idea of using oxygen, calling it unsporting and artificial. But after experiencing the debilitating effects of extreme altitude, he changed his mind. That same 1922 expedition ended in tragedy when an avalanche killed 7 Sherpa porters. The guilt haunted Mallory deeply. He blamed himself for pushing too hard, for wanting the summit more than safety. By 1924, George Mallory was 37 years old, considered ancient for high-altitude climbing. His body bore the scars of previous expeditions: frostbitten fingers and toes, lungs weakened by repeated exposure to thin air. His marriage was strained, His wife Ruth wanted him home, safe with their 3 young children, Claire, Berridge, and John. But Mallory couldn't shake the pull of the mountain. Everest had become his white whale, the peak that defined his entire existence. He wrote to Ruth before the final attempt, telling her this would be his last try. Win or lose, he promised, he would come home after this. It was a promise he would never keep. Some historians believe Mallory felt enormous pressure to succeed, not just for himself, but for Britain and the entire climbing establishment. Andrew Common Irvine was everything George Mallory wasn't: young, untested, and bursting with raw potential. Born in 1902 in Birkenhead, England, Sandy, as everyone called him, showed mechanical genius from childhood. While other boys played with toys, Irvine dismantled clocks and rebuilt engines. His father was a successful businessman, and the family was comfortable financially, allowing Sandy to pursue his interests freely. During World War I, while still a teenager, he designed an interrupter gear that allowed machine guns to fire through spinning propeller blades without shooting them off. Military engineers had struggled with the problem for months. Irvine solved it in his bedroom, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that seemed almost supernatural. At Merton College, Oxford, Andrew Irvine became a rowing star. He was built like a machine himself, broad-shouldered and powerful, with lungs that seemed bottomless. In 1923, he helped Oxford defeat Cambridge in the annual boat race, a victory that made national headlines across Britain. Irvine rowed in the number 4 position, considered one of the most demanding seats in the boat. His teammates described him as relentless in training, always pushing himself and others to improve. But Irvine wanted more than athletic glory. He wanted adventure, the kind that tested not just muscle, but mind and spirit. That same year, he joined an Oxford expedition to Spitsbergen, a frozen archipelago north of Norway. The Arctic expedition to Spitsbergen was brutal, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees. But Sandy Irvine thrived where others struggled. The expedition's purpose was to survey glaciers and conduct geological research, but it also served as training for young men who dreamed of greater adventures. Equipment constantly failed in the extreme cold. Stoves refused to light, instruments froze solid, and clothing became stiff as boards. Irvine spent hours each day repairing and improvising solutions. He modified their Primus stoves to work more efficiently, redesigned their sledges to pull more smoothly over ice, and even improved their tent designs. His practical genius impressed everyone on the expedition. George Mallory was also on that Spitsbergen expedition, and he watched Irvine closely. Mallory saw something special in the young man, an ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart, a gift for making broken things work again. Most importantly, Mallory saw someone who could handle the oxygen equipment. The bottled oxygen systems used on Everest were primitive, heavy, and prone to failure. They leaked, froze, and broke at the worst possible moments. Climbers needed someone who could troubleshoot them at 28,000 feet, where the air was too thin to think clearly. Irvine was that person, the mechanical genius who could mean the difference between life and death on the highest mountain on Earth. The decision to take Sandy Irvine to Everest was controversial within the climbing community. He was only 22 years old and had never climbed above 20,000 feet. More experienced mountaineers on the 1924 expedition felt passed over and undervalued. Noel Odell, a geologist and skilled climber, thought he should have been Mallory's partner for the summit attempt. Edward Norton, the expedition leader, had serious doubts about Irvine's lack of high-altitude experience. But George Mallory insisted with characteristic determination. He believed Irvine's technical skills with the oxygen sets would make the difference between success and failure. In hindsight, it was a decision that would either prove genius or fatal. Some expedition members wrote in their diaries that Mallory seemed almost obsessed with taking the young Irvine to the summit. The 1924 British Everest expedition left Liverpool on February 29th, Leap Day, aboard the SS California. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, an extra day in the calendar for an impossible attempt at history. The team spent weeks traveling through India by train, watching the landscape change from coastal cities to the foothills of the Himalayas. They then trekked for another month through Tibet to reach Everest Base Camp, passing through ancient monasteries and villages where locals warned them about the mountain's deadly nature. By modern standards, their equipment was laughably inadequate. They wore wool coats, cotton shirts, and leather boots, with nails hammered into the soles for traction. Their tents were canvas. Their sleeping bags were down-filled, but still left them shivering through the night at high camps. The oxygen equipment was especially problematic for the expedition. Each set weighed over 30 pounds and consisted of steel cylinders, rubber tubes, and a crude face mask. The valves froze regularly in the extreme cold. The masks leaked precious oxygen. Climbers had to choose between the extra weight of carrying oxygen or the torture of climbing without it. In the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body begins to shut down. Sandy Irvine spent hours at base camp and higher camps tinkering with the sets, reducing weight wherever possible, fixing leaks, and improving flow rates. He stripped unnecessary metal parts, lightened the frames, and adjusted the valves to deliver oxygen more efficiently. His mechanical wizardry gave the team hope that oxygen might actually help rather than hinder their summit bid. The expedition established camps progressively up the mountain through May. Camp 3 sat at 21,000 feet, Camp 4 at 23,000 feet, Camp 5 at 25,000 feet, and Camp 6 at 26,800 feet. Each camp was nothing more than a few tents clinging to icy ledges, buffeted by winds that could reach 100 miles per hour. Climbers had to acclimatize slowly, going up and down the mountain repeatedly to let their bodies adjust to the thinning air. Several team members fell ill with altitude sickness, experiencing crushing headaches, nausea, and confusion. Others suffered frostbite that would leave permanent damage. The Sherpas, whose strength and courage made the entire expedition possible, carried load after load of supplies upward, establishing food caches and oxygen depots at each camp. Edward Norton made the first summit attempt without oxygen on June 4th, reaching 28,126 feet before being forced back by snow blindness and complete exhaustion. He had climbed higher than any human being in recorded history, but the summit remained over 900 feet above him, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Norton later described the experience as like drowning on dry land, each breath bringing insufficient oxygen to his starving brain and muscles. His heroic attempt proved that climbing without oxygen was possible, but probably not enough to reach the top. That left one hope: George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, with their oxygen sets, climbing together. They would have one chance, one clear weather window, to do what had never been done before. On June 6th, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine left Camp 4 for the last time. They spent that night at Camp 5, then pushed up to Camp 6 on June 7th. Noel Odell, climbing in support behind them, watched them establish the high camp and settle in for the night. The weather was holding, clear and cold, perfect conditions for a summit attempt. Everything was falling into place. Mallory wrote a final note to expedition filmmaker John Noel, asking him to have the camera ready for their return. There was no doubt in his words, no hesitation. They were going for the summit. They would either succeed or die trying. Mallory also left a note for Odell, detailing their plans and asking him to support from below if possible. June 8, 1924, dawned clear and cold on the upper slopes of Everest. George Mallory and Sandy Irvine left Camp 6 sometime around 5 or 6 a.m., though no exact time was recorded. They carried oxygen, ice axes, rope, and little else. Every ounce mattered at that altitude where each step required enormous effort. Odell, climbing behind them, reached Camp 6 around midday and looked up toward the summit ridge. At 12:50 p.m., the clouds parted for just a moment. Through the gap, Odell saw two tiny black figures moving upward on the ridge. They appeared strong, climbing steadily toward the summit, before the clouds closed in again. That glimpse, lasting perhaps a minute, was the last confirmed sighting of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine alive. What happened next remains one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries. Noel Odell waited at Camp 6 for hours, expecting to see them descending victorious or defeated. When they didn't appear by evening, he knew something was terribly wrong. The next day, he climbed as high as he could, shouting their names into the wind until his voice was hoarse. Silence answered him. Search parties spent days scouring the upper mountain, risking their own lives in desperate hope. They found nothing, no tracks, no gear, no sign that Mallory and Irvine had ever been there. Everest had swallowed them completely, as if they had never existed. The weather turned savage, with storms preventing further searches. The expedition returned to Britain in defeat and mourning. George Mallory's wife, Ruth, was devastated by the news. She had feared this outcome, but hoped against it until the end. Their 3 children, Claire, Barrage, and John, would grow up without a father, forever wondering if he had died achieving his dream or fallen short. Sandy Irvine's mother was heartbroken, her brilliant son gone before his life truly began. The climbing community was shaken to its core. 2 of Britain's best had vanished on the mountain. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Had they reached the summit before dying? Did they turn back short of the goal? Without bodies or evidence, there was no way to know. Memorial services were held, and both men were hailed as heroes who gave their lives to exploration. In 1933, 9 years after the disappearance, British climber Percy Wynne Harris found an ice axe at 27,160 feet on the northeast ridge. It was identified as belonging to either George Mallory or Sandy Irvine, though which one remained uncertain. The axe was lying on rocks, not stuck into ice, suggesting it had been dropped rather than used for an arrest during a fall. Some experts believed the location indicated the pair had been descending when disaster struck. Others thought it proved they had been close to the summit, perhaps even successful. The axe raised more questions than it answered, and Everest kept its secrets locked in ice for another 66 years. The discovery reignited public interest and speculation about their fate. In May 1999, an expedition led by climbers Conrad Anker and Dave Hahn set out specifically to search for George Mallory and Sandy Irvine. They focused on the area where Chinese climbers claimed to have seen a body in 1975. The Chinese account was vague but tantalizing. An English dead lying in old clothing. On May 1st, Anker was searching at around 27,000 feet when he spotted something pale against the gray rock. At first, he thought it was a piece of old tent fabric. As he got closer, his heart began to pound. It was a body, perfectly preserved by the cold, lying face down with arms outstretched, as if still trying to stop a fall that happened 75 years earlier. The body was frozen into the mountain, bleached white by decades of UV radiation. The clothing was intact, layers of wool and cotton, hobnailed boots, a leather belt. Around the waist was a length of broken rope, severed cleanly, suggesting a catastrophic fall while roped to a partner. Conrad Anker and the team carefully examined the body, searching for identification. Inside a shirt collar, they found a name tag, G. Mallory. They had found George Mallory, 75 years after he disappeared. The discovery made headlines worldwide, reigniting debate about whether he had reached the summit. But it also deepened the mystery because Mallory's body answered some questions while raising others that might never be solved. George Mallory's injuries were severe and told part of the story. His right leg was badly broken, bones shattered in multiple places. His forehead bore a puncture wound, possibly from his ice axe striking him during the fall. The rope around his waist was snapped, indicating he and Sandy Irvine had been tied together when one or both fell. Most intriguingly, Mallory's snow goggles were in his pocket, not on his face. This suggested he had been descending in low light, either at dusk or dawn, when goggles weren't needed. Climbers debated endlessly what this meant. Had they summited and were descending late? Or had they turned back before reaching the top and were caught by darkness? The team searched George Mallory's pockets carefully and found letters, a monogrammed handkerchief, and other personal items. But they didn't find what everyone hoped for, a photograph of his wife Ruth. Mallory had famously told friends he planned to leave Ruth's picture on the summit if he reached it, a romantic gesture typical of the era. The missing photograph fueled speculation that he had indeed made it to the top and left it there as promised. However, the photo could have been lost during the fall, blown away by wind, or simply not carried on the final day. Without more evidence, it proved nothing definite. Some forensic experts analyzed the position of his body and theorized he had fallen from above, sliding down the mountain face. What was most frustrating about finding George Mallory, there was no camera. Sandy Irvine was known to have been carrying a Kodak vest pocket camera, borrowed from fellow climber Howard Somerville. If Irvine still had that camera when he died, and if the film inside survived the freezing conditions, it could contain the proof everyone wanted: photographs from the summit of Everest taken in 1924. Kodak experts confirmed that film from that era, frozen at Everest's extreme cold, could potentially still be developed using modern techniques. The emulsion might be damaged, but images could likely be recovered. The camera became a holy grail of mountaineering history. Find Irvine, find the camera, solve the mystery forever. Chinese climber Wang Hongbao claimed in 1979 that he had found a body at around 26,575 feet during China's 1975 Everest expedition. Wang described the body as English dead in old-fashioned clothing, lying at around 8,400 meters. He indicated it was about 20 minutes walking distance from the Chinese camp. Wang made the claim to a Japanese climber, communicating through gestures and broken English because of the language barrier. The next day, tragically, Wang was killed in an avalanche before he could provide more details or show anyone the exact location. His story became another tantalizing clue in the mystery. Had he found Sandy Irvine? If so, why didn't the Chinese report it or recover the body? The questions multiplied, and Irvine remained lost to history. For 25 years after George Mallory's discovery, expeditions searched for Sandy Irvine with increasing desperation. Teams combed the areas where Wang might have walked, scanning couloirs and ice fields with binoculars and drones. Some claimed to have seen anomalies in the ice that could be bodies or equipment. Others found old oxygen bottles and rope fragments from the 1924 expedition. But nothing definitively connected to Irvine appeared anywhere. The mountain seemed determined to keep its final secret buried. Then, in September 2024, everything changed when that boot emerged from the central Rongbuk Glacier, bringing Irvine back to the world after a century of silence. The discovery location was significant for several reasons. Sandy Irvine's boot and foot were found much lower on the mountain, than where George Mallory's body lay, and far down the glacier from the summit route. Glaciologists explained that the central Rongbuk Glacier flows downward over time, carrying anything frozen within it. If Irvine had died high on the mountain in 1924, his body could have been buried in snow, incorporated into the glacier, and slowly transported downward over the course of a century. As climate change accelerated glacier melting in recent decades, the ice finally released what it had held, revealing Irvine's remains after 100 years. Scientists estimate the glacier moves approximately 50 to 100 feet per year. The team that found the boot immediately recognized its historical importance. They documented everything with photographs and GPS coordinates before carefully removing the boot and foot for DNA testing. Sandy Irvine's great-niece, Julie Summers, a historian who had written extensively about her great-uncle, was contacted. DNA samples from Irvine's living relatives were compared with tissue from the remains. In late 2024, the results came back positive. The remains were definitively Andrew Common Irvine. After 100 years, his family finally had closure. But the camera, the precious camera that might contain proof of a 1924 summit, was not with the boot. The search would have to continue if more of his remains are revealed by the melting ice. But George Mallory and Sandy Irvine weren't the only dreamers drawn to Everest by obsession. Another man, more unlikely than either of them, would attempt the impossible a decade later. His name was Maurice Wilson, and his story is even stranger, more tragic and more inexplicable. Wilson was born in 1898 in Bradford, Yorkshire, into a working-class family. His father was a textile worker, and Maurice grew up knowing hardship and struggle. He fought in World War I, where he was wounded in combat and awarded the Military Cross for bravery under fire. The war left him traumatized, struggling with what we now call PTSD. He drifted through the 1920s, working various jobs in England and New Zealand, searching for meaning in a world that felt broken and purposeless after the horrors he had witnessed in the trenches. In the early 1930s, Maurice Wilson became obsessed with fasting and spiritualism. He believed that through prayer, fasting, and sheer willpower, a person could achieve anything, even the impossible. He claimed to have cured himself of tuberculosis through a 35-day fast combined with intense prayer and meditation. Whether he actually had tuberculosis or merely believed he did remains unclear, but the experience convinced him that faith could overcome any physical obstacle. He read about Everest in newspapers and became convinced that he was meant to climb it, that God or fate had chosen him for this purpose. Not as part of an expedition with experienced mountaineers and Sherpas, but alone, guided by faith and determination. The problem was obvious to everyone but Maurice Wilson. He had never climbed a mountain in his life. He had no training, no experience, and no understanding whatsoever of what high-altitude mountaineering involved. He didn't know how to use an ice axe, couldn't read a map properly, and had never worn crampons. Friends and acquaintances tried to dissuade him, explaining that Everest had defeated the world's best climbers and killed many of them. Wilson dismissed their concerns. He believed his spiritual preparation would transcend physical limitations. He spent months fasting, sometimes going weeks, eating almost nothing, convinced this would make him lighter and able to survive on the mountain without heavy supplies. Maurice Wilson hatched an extraordinary plan that defied all logic. He would learn to fly an airplane, purchase his own aircraft, fly it from Britain to Tibet, crash land on the slopes of Everest at around 15,000 feet, then climb to the summit alone, while fasting and praying. To anyone with even basic knowledge of aviation or mountaineering, the plan was suicidal, impossible, insane. But Wilson was undeterred by criticism or common sense. He took flying lessons in London and bought a used Gypsy Moth biplane for $500, which he named Everest in a play on Everest. British authorities, hearing of his plan, refused to grant him permission to fly to Tibet. They revoked his flying license and warned him not to attempt the journey. Wilson didn't care. He planned to go anyway, with or without official blessing. In May 1933, Maurice Wilson took off from Britain and flew south across Europe in his Gypsy Moth. He navigated across the Mediterranean, through the Middle East, facing sandstorms and mechanical failures. British officials sent cables to stations along his route, ordering them not to refuel his plane. Wilson evaded them cleverly, sometimes landing in remote areas and buying fuel from locals who had no idea he was wanted by authorities. He crashed once in Egypt, but repaired the damage himself using his wartime mechanical skills. After weeks of flying, covering thousands of miles solo, he reached India. There, the British colonial government impounded his plane at Lalbaloo airfield and ordered him to stop this madness. Wilson refused to quit. If he couldn't fly to Everest, he would walk there instead, no matter how long it took. Maurice Wilson traveled to Darjeeling and began preparing to trek into Tibet illegally. The British controlled access to Everest through Tibet and had a strict permit system for expeditions. Wilson had no permit and no intention of getting one. He bought basic climbing equipment from local shops, having no idea what was actually necessary. He hired Sherpa porters who were sympathetic to his determination, 3 men named Tawang, Rinzing, and Tsering. He disguised himself as a Buddhist monk, wearing robes and keeping his head covered to avoid detection. In March 1934, Wilson and his 3 Sherpas set off on foot toward Everest, traveling at night and hiding during the day to avoid British officials who were searching for him. The Sherpas knew this was madness, but couldn't dissuade him and needed the money. The journey took weeks of brutal travel, crossing high passes and barren plateaus in freezing conditions. Maurice Wilson had no idea what he was doing. He didn't know how to use crampons or an ice axe properly. He didn't understand altitude sickness or the necessity of acclimatization, the slow process of letting the body adjust to thinning air. The Sherpas tried to explain the dangers, but Wilson believed his fasting and spiritual practices would protect him from physical harm. He carried minimal food, convinced he would fast his way up the mountain. By April, they reached the Rongbuk Monastery at the base of Everest. The monks were astonished by this strange Englishman who planned to climb the mountain alone. They warned him it was impossible, that the mountain gods would not allow it, and that he would die. Wilson thanked them politely and kept preparing for his attempt. On May 12, 1934, Maurice Wilson began his doomed attempt on Everest. The Sherpas accompanied him as far as Camp 3 at around 21,000 feet, trying to help despite knowing the effort was doomed from the start. Wilson had no idea how to move on ice, constantly slipping and falling. His leather boots, inadequate for high-altitude climbing, gave him no grip. The altitude hit him hard, leaving him gasping and dizzy, his untrained body rebelling against the thin air. After only a few days, suffering from severe altitude sickness, his Sherpas begged him to turn back and save his life. Wilson refused their pleas. He ordered them to leave him alone, insisting this was his destiny. Reluctantly, fearing for their own safety, they descended to base camp. Maurice Wilson spent several more days trying to push higher, crawling through snow, coughing blood, his body shutting down from lack of food and oxygen. He made multiple attempts to reach higher camps, each time being turned back by his deteriorating condition. His diary entries became increasingly desperate and incoherent. He wrote about hearing voices, about his determination to succeed, about his faith sustaining him. He attempted to reach Camp 4 multiple times, but kept collapsing from exhaustion. On May 21st, Wilson made his final diary entry. The words were barely legible, written by a man on the edge of death. He described terrible cold, exhaustion, and the realization that he was beaten. The mountain had won. Maurice Wilson's body was found a year later, in 1935, by members of the British Everest expedition. He was lying in his tent at around 21,000 feet, frozen solid, his diary beside him. The tent was shredded by wind, and Wilson had clearly died of exposure and altitude sickness. The Sherpas who found him buried the body in a crevasse, as was customary, but it later emerged from the ice and was found again in 1960, by which time it had largely decomposed. His remains have been seen periodically since then, a grim reminder of hubris. Some climbers report seeing scraps of clothing and bones near Camp 3, all that remains of Maurice Wilson's impossible dream. Maurice Wilson's story is often dismissed as the folly of a madman, but it's more complex than that simple judgment. He was a broken man searching for redemption, for a purpose that had been taken from him by war. The trenches of World War I had destroyed the world he knew and left him adrift, unable to find meaning in ordinary life. He believed, genuinely and completely, that faith and willpower could overcome physical limitations. He was wrong, tragically wrong, but his courage, however misguided, cannot be denied. He died alone on a frozen mountain, pursuing a dream that was never possible. In his own tragic way, Maurice Wilson belongs in the story of Everest, a reminder that the mountain does not discriminate. It defeats the inexperienced and the expert alike with equal indifference. George Mallory, Sandy Irvine, and Maurice Wilson represent different aspects of the Everest obsession that has claimed so many lives over the past century. Mallory was the perfectionist, the climber who couldn't let go until he'd succeeded or died trying. Irvine was the prodigy, the young genius who trusted his mentor and followed him into the unknown, his potential cut short before the world could see what he might have become. Wilson was the dreamer, the man who believed willpower alone could conquer nature, a tragic figure whose faith exceeded his abilities. All three died on the mountain, swallowed by its storms and ice, their bodies eventually revealed by the slow work of time. Their stories are intertwined, part of the layered history of humanity's attempts to stand where the earth meets the sky. Did George Mallory and Sandy Irvine reach the summit of Everest on June 8, 1924? The evidence suggests they came heartbreakingly close, but close isn't enough when history demands proof. The missing camera remains the key to everything. If it's found and the film can be developed, we may finally know whether two men stood on top of the world 3 decades before Hillary and Norgay. Until that day, the question remains suspended in the frozen air, as eternal and unyielding as the mountain itself.